Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Daniel Marston. I believe for this course, most of you know me, but some of you don't. And I welcome you to the course Neuropsychology. For the next 10 weeks, we are going to be talking about the brain, how the brain functions, what some of the main parts are of the brain, how they impact behavior, and how generally the field of neuroscience, specifically behavioral neuroscience, um, can help in the healthcare field, particularly psychotherapy, clinical psychology, and counseling psychology. I am a clinical psychologist, a licensed psychologist. I am, as some of you know, I am in Pennsylvania. I am a licensed psychologist in Pennsylvania, not in California. But um, that's not particularly relevant for this course. The material we cover here applies um, in every state, in every country. It's universal. So, just to tell you a little bit about how this course will work. I will let you read the syllabus, and I can certainly answer any questions you have about the syllabus. In fact, I would strongly encourage and ask you to please be prepared with any questions that you have about the syllabus when we meet. Um, I will. I am willing to answer any questions, but just to generally give you some ideas, there will be two lectures each week. One will be the video lecture, and one will be the live lecture. This video lecture will be, as I said in the syllabus, online in the Moodle um, course materials by 6 a.m. your time on Tuesday mornings. One thing I will tell you in class on Thursday is next week I will be out of town. I'm leaving Monday afternoon. I'll be unavailable Monday morning, and I will actually be back in my office just before our Thursday night class. So I will be unavailable Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of next week. Um, so the video will be online earlier. Typically it'll be online, like I said, by Tuesday morning, but typically it'll be online sometime Monday evening. Um, and given that we're 3 hours, there's a 3 hours difference. Even if I recorded at um, 11:30 or midnight, which actually is not out of the realm of possibility for me, um, you could still view it at like 9 at night at the on a Monday night. So it'll always be by 6 a.m. your time Tuesday, but typically we'll be there earlier, and by the time it'll be online uh, by Monday morning, the earliest next week, because I'll be out of town. Okay. You can look at the syllabus. Main there are tests um, that we have in this course. One of the reasons I stress that the grade is based primarily on test and class participation is you want to take notes. You want to take notes. I will also, if I'm using any written materials, any documents other than my own notes, or just off the top of my head, I will send them to you, or I will try to post them online uh, if um, uh, if the uh, if the rules allow me to, if the copyright laws allow me to. So you can't count on my always being able to post the written materials online, but I will try to do that as much as I can. Again, subject to copyright rules. Um, and then, so you want to take notes on material because it could very well be on the test. Um, there are two. I want to tell you a little bit about how I approach this course. In my view of neuropsychology, I've worked in neuropsychology as a clinical psychologist throughout my career. I've been licensed as a psychologist for over 20 years, and I've always worked in some branch of neuropsychology as part of my clinical work. Part of the reason for that is because I started out as a specialist in geriatric psychology. Um, so, geriatric psychology is, of course, clinical psychology. I was in the clinical end, as it applies to individuals over 65 or over. So that field has always had a strong neuropsychology component to it because a lot of times individuals in their later years, um, a lot of times the problems that they are suffering is because of medical issues related to neuropsychological problems, Alzheimer's disease, stroke, that sort of thing. So neuropsychology has always been a big part of um, of what I do. So I have a lot of experience in neuropsychology, and I would agree with the materials that I have read and discussed with people that basically describe neuropsychology as having two major parts to it, two major parts to neuropsychology. One is the realm of what is called clinical neuropsychology. Clinical neuropsychology specifically has to do with the psychological aspects of um, memory, executive functioning, um, and behavioral activation as they apply to neurological disorders. So, clinical neuropsychology studies to a great extent the impact on behavior and cognitive functioning of um, neurological disorders. So, um, clinical neuropsychology um, involves a lot of information about testing, where uh, where the tests are designed to address things like memory, executive functioning, um, as I said, behavioral activation. Those are all, and executive functioning is things like attention, organization, um, the higher level cognitive processing. So, clinical neuropsychology has a lot to do with the um, psychological and cognitive aspects of neurological disease, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, head injury. Um, it is often considered a field separate from clinical psychology. Now, clinical psychologists often do neuropsychological assessment. I do quite a lot of neuropsychological assessment, um, but it is considered a separate field from specifically just clinical psychology. I um, was exposed to this early on in my clinical training and my clinical internship for my doctoral program. I worked at a VA medical center in Cleveland, Ohio. I had when you do an internship, you do rotations. So if it's a 12-month internship, you do 4 months on one unit, 4 months on another unit. And one of my rotations was neuropsychology. And I remember when I went there, the my supervisor on that rotation said at the beginning, okay, this is neuropsychology, so you need to forget everything you learned about clinical psychology. So there wasn't much therapy, there wasn't much counseling, it was mostly testing and behavioral planning based on the testing results. So that's one aspect of neuropsychology, which again I would say is the clinical neuropsychology part. The other aspect of neuropsychology as a field is what is called behavioral neuroscience. And behavioral neuroscience is the field of neuroscience that that addresses um, how the brain impacts day-to-day behaviors. And in the field of clinical psychology, behavioral science is particularly relevant in terms of determining how neuroscience impacts psychotherapy, how neuroscience impacts um, what issues the person needs to deal with, how those issues are impacting them, how treatment is most likely to work and be effective. So, all of those are a big part of behavioral neuroscience. So, so in my view of the field of neuropsychology is really split into these two main areas: clinical neuropsychology, which I would say applies mainly to the psychological impact of neurological diseases, and behavioral neuroscience, which is the impact of neurological functioning on day to day function, how our brain impacts day to day functioning. And as they apply to clinical work, clinical neuropsychology is a separate is pretty much a separate field unto itself. It's assessment of the neurological impact. I'm sorry, the psychological impact of neurological disease. And as it applies to clinical work, behavioral neuroscience is that field of study on how neurological functioning impacts psychological interventions, um, uh, psychotherapy, behavioral approaches, counseling, all those things, and what role neurological factors have in the effectiveness of therapy, how therapy works, and that sort of thing. I will address both of those, but I can tell you that this course is primarily focused on the behavioral neuroscience part. What was interesting is I received questions I from at least one person. I don't know if that person ended up taking the course. Um, I don't think she did. I'm not sure. It may have been one of you, but I think it was somebody who didn't end up taking the course. Where they asked about how, and some of you may have noticed this, where what was written in the course catalog was different from my description of the course. And I actually wrote a new description of the course for the course catalog, but I guess it wasn't put in before a lot of people registered for this course. One of the reasons I bring this up is when I was asked to teach this course, I was very happy to do so. But I told them, I said, when I teach neuropsychology, I teach it more from the behavioral neuroscience end than the clinical neuropsychology end. And the course catalog description was very much in the clinical neuropsychology. It specifically mentioned that the course primarily had to do with neurological disorders. And I said, that's fine, but that's not primarily what I teach. I teach more of the behavioral neuroscience, which is how neuroscience impacts the understanding of clinical psychology, psychological counseling, healthcare, all that sort of thing. And they were fine with that. I mean, CIHS was fine, provided both clinical neuropsychology and behavioral neuroscience were covering a lot of basic material anyway on how the brain works and that sort of thing. So um, a lot of the basic material that you would receive in an introductory course like this would be the same no matter what avenue you come from. But later on, when we talk about the application of it, there's differences. So they were fine with that. But that's a good example of how if you saw the original course catalog description and then compared it to the brief description you get when you ask about this course, the summary that they give you would have noticed that you could see that each one covers a separate area. The original one was more from the clinical neuropsychology end. Mine was more from the clinical psychology and the behavioral neuroscience end. So now you will also notice that the texts that we use are um, are more on the behavioral neuroscience end. There are two books that we have here. Now there will be a lot of material that I send you. I haven't got a lot of it. I haven't got any of it online yet, but I have stuff to put out there. I just got to check on copyright and some of the formatting isn't working out well as far as my putting on Moodle. So I'm going to try to have some out to you before the first class starts, but I can't guarantee that. Um, but so there's going to be a lot of articles, a lot of written materials um, in addition to the texts. But there are two texts in this, and both of them are the application of behavioral neuroscience as it relates to clinical work. One is in the field of what is called neuropsychoanalysis. And neuropsychoanalysis is um, uh, the neurological evidence to support concepts and treatment approaches that have been associated with the field of psychoanalysis. That is a fascinating field because Freud was a neurologist. Sigmund Freud was a neurologist. And he is considered, despite the fact that many of his theories have been disproven, um, criticized in the past 100+ years, he is very much considered the founder of clinical psychology. Um, and and many of his followers are considered the biggest names in clinical psychology in the history of clinical psychology. Erikson was a psychoanalyst. Uh, uh, Erik Erikson was a psychoanalyst. Um, Adler was a psychoanalyst. Freud's daughter, Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, is a psychoanalyst in her own right. She wasn't just repeating what her father said. She had her own. She's actually considered the founder of clinical child psychology. Child psychology as a clinical field didn't exist until she started her work. Um, and Carl Jung. I always like to stress Carl Jung because, in my opinion, many of the things we talk about in the clinical courses here in at CIHS, Carl Jung talked about him at some point. I mean, much of what we talk, even stuff that Carl Jung talked about, then nobody else ever talked about again. Some of it gets brought up in the clinical materials that are emphasized here at CIHS. So I think Carl Jung is probably the most prominent um, major figure in clinical psychology that relates directly to CIHS work. Um, he was a psychoanalyst. So the psychoanalytic field has offered a lot to modern clinical psychology. Why I bring up those original names is Sigmund Freud was a neurologist. And Freud said, as he was writing about these works, and the quote is in your text on neuropsychoanalysis, said, everything I'm talking about will be proven by neurology at some point. And a lot of that has happened. There's a lot of work on neuropsychoanalysis. A lot of times the researchers um, call it the non-conscious as opposed to the unconscious. because there's not as much distinction in the neurological realm between the unconscious and the subconscious. Um, but a lot of the ideas that Freud proposed and his earlier followers proposed in some form have been supported by neurological research now, as far as subconscious, unconscious factors, drives, instincts, uh, conflicts, internal conflicts. So so that's one area that we will be studying, is what does modern behavioral neuroscience tell us about some of the more complex factors associated with psychological and emotional functioning. Then the second book will be on neuroscience as it applies to um, trauma therapy. The neuroscience of trauma is a fascinating field and really shows how much neuroscience plays a role in understanding what we as clinical psychologists, counselors can do. Um, I like those two books. I like stressing out. There will be some articles that I also present to you that will be specifically journal articles related to neuropsychoanalysis. Um, and uh, you know, they'll all provide important materials. I'll provide you basics about the way the brain works, but much of it's going to be what we're going to get to as the course moves along is the practical applications. Is how does this apply in terms of what you can do for helping someone, and certainly along the way we will talk about the different neurological impact or the behavioral and psychological impact um, neurological disorders. We'll talk about the different parts of the brain and how they factor in. A couple points, I guess, I want to you to keep in mind before I wrap up here. By the way, this lecture is going to be shorter than the later ones. I didn't want to get too much into stuff until I had a chance to meet everybody. Um, but when I talk about psychological functioning, almost always this applies, but definitely in a neuropsychology course, I am talking about not just emotions and mood and behaviors, but also things like memory, attention. I use terms like executive functioning. Executive functioning is considered to be the higher level of cognitive functioning. Um, uh, um, Part of that is organization, behavioral initiation, which is that part of the brain that gets us doing things. Organization is how we or how we organize things. Following patterns, um, and establishing complex patterns. It's interesting to consider, for example, um, how speech, verbal speech, clearly is a way that we recognize patterns. You know, um, a child at, say, 1.5, you show them a ball and they can learn to say, um, okay, this is a ball. You show them a ball and they can use the word ball. But if you think about it, it's amazing that by the time that child then becomes 4, if not earlier, um, if you show them a picture of a ball, they also will say ball. In other words, they've learned a pattern that the same word applies um, to this object, applies also to the picture of an object on a piece of paper. So if if you think of it technically, if I show them a picture, and I don't have one here, but if I show them a picture of a ball, I actually am not showing them a ball. I am showing them a piece of paper. So every picture, if they ask a child, if you show someone a picture and you ask the child, "What is this?" the answer should always be a piece of paper because that's what it is. Um, but children learn the pattern that a ball is the picture of a ball, or can learn to use the word dog for a variety of different animals that would fit in the category of dog, even if they have never seen that dog before. So we learn patterns, and we learn them pretty quickly in a young age. And that is part of this higher level executive functioning, where we can develop patterns that then lead to speech and our ability to communicate with other people. So when I talk about psychological functioning, particularly in this course, I am applying not to just emotions and behaviors, but also what would be called cognitive functioning. Um, and cognitive functioning is things like are the neurological are the neuropsychological aspects of human behavior. Like I said, memory, attention, executive functioning, that sort of thing. Those of you who have taken the assessment course, I know several of you had the assessment course that I just finished teaching. Um, Often part of psychological assessment is some form of cognitive testing. A mini mental status examination is a good example, which is just exclusively cognitive functioning. So very often a comprehensive psychological uh, um, examination will include some measure of cognitive function. Now, a very comprehensive psychological um, examination may include a rather comprehensive neuropsychological function. One thing we will talk about are the different types of neuropsychological tests. There are things like mini mental status examinations, which are just like 30 items. I mean, they're pretty quick. They give just a general overview of the person's psychological function. But then there is the more comprehensive one. There's the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which is an IQ test. And IQ is often seen as a measure of a measure of global cognitive functioning. IQ intelligence testing often are seen as a type of um, neuropsychological tests. And then there are even more in depth neuropsychological tests, which delve into things like attention and executive functioning and memory. There is a Wechsler. The main IQ test is called the Wechsler, Wechsler, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. There is also a Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, so there are two different IQ tests there. Actually, there's three because there's a preschool version as well. Um, but then there is also a test called the Wechsler Memory Scale, which is a comprehensive, lengthy test that does only memory. So there are various in depth ones. Um, there are what are called neuropsychological test batteries. One is called the Luria, Luria dash Nebraska, like the state. It is the state that's named after Luria, Nebraska, which is a very comprehensive neuropsychological test, which tests only aspects of cognitive functioning and can take like 8 hours to give. Um, so, um, so the realm of neuropsychological testing is rather vast. Uh, so we will be talking about that, but I bring that up just to make sure you know that when we talk about psychological functioning in a comprehensive way, we are talking not just about emotions, not just about behavior, not just about personality, but also aspects of cognitive neuropsychological functioning as well, including memory, attention, organization, behavioral initiation, and those sorts of things. Okay. So, and by the way, there are um, there are a large number of psychologists who call themselves neuropsychologists. So you can specialize in neuropsychology. Um, and we will talk about that field. Um, and typically, what those are in most states, you can't get. I don't think there's any states you can get licensed just as a neuropsychologist. What you do is you get licensed as a psychologist, but then you can specialize in neuropsychological assessment. Okay, I think this is a good place to stop for now. Like I said, I didn't want to cover too much before we met on Thursday. So I will see you all on Thursday, and keep your eye out on the course materials because I may start downloading some other articles or some articles for you to review. You don't have to review them by the first class. I understand that everybody's just getting started here, but you can take a look at them. I'll try to have them on there as quick as I can. Okay, take care, everybody. I'll see you on Thursday.